The Tennessee hills usually woke Helen Everett with birdsong and the steady hum of her old stove. But on this morning, something heavier pierced the quiet. It wasn't footsteps. It was dragging, slow, labored, scraping across frozen gravel. She pulled back the curtain, and there, in the dim light, a wild bobcat appeared. Its shoulders hunched beneath the tattered coat, ribs sharp under the fur. Yet it hauled a filthy canvas bag as though its life depended on it. Frost glistened on the strap it clenched in its jaws, the weight carving a crooked trail toward her porch. Helen's pulse quickened. At 68, she knew the dangers of predators this close to home. Instinct told her the animal was stealing, perhaps feed, perhaps scraps, but the determination in its movements carried something deeper. She pressed closer to the glass, unaware that what she was about to witness would reshape the rhythm of her quiet life forever. The bobcat strained forward until it reached the steps of Helen's farmhouse. Then, with surprising care, it released the bag at the bottom of the porch. Its green eyes lifted into the glow of the porch light, unblinking, steady, almost deliberate. Helen gripped the doorframe, heart pounding. She half expected the animal to leap for her chickens, but it didn't advance. Instead, it stepped back, shoulders taut, gaze locked as though waiting. The canvas twitched faintly, sending a jolt through Helen's chest. It wasn't the wind. Something inside was alive. Her breath fogged the glass as she leaned closer, torn between fear and fascination. The animal did not growl. It did not bare its teeth. It only stood sentinel at the edge of the frost, leaving the bag like an offering. Helen's mind raced, her instincts screaming caution, but her heart whispered that this wild visitor had come not to steal, but to entrust.
Curiosity overcame hesitation. Helen stepped onto the porch, the cold biting through her wool socks. Kneeling slowly, she pulled at the frayed flap of the canvas bag. The smell of smoke and dirt rose into the air. Then, two faint pinpoints blinked up at her, eyes far too large for a face so small. A bobcat kitten lay crumpled inside, ribs visible beneath its patchy fur. Its tiny paws pressed weakly against the canvas, but trembled and fell back with exhaustion. A shallow scrape across its leg oozed dark, rust-colored streaks. Helen's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't stolen food or scavenged trash. This was life itself, delivered fragile and broken at her doorstep. Behind her, the mother bobcat stood unmoving, gaze fixed on the scene. Helen reached trembling fingers toward the tiny body, realizing that in one heartbeat, her morning had shifted from quiet routine to an unexpected battle for survival. The air around Helen seemed to still. The tiny body shuddered faintly, fighting for breath, fighting for another moment of life. Logic told her to step away, to let nature sort itself, to remember the warnings about predators too close to homes. Yet years of teaching children had etched another instinct into her soul, the instinct to protect. The kitten's sides rose and fell like a trapped bird's wings, fragile but desperate. Helen's chest tightened. This was not about convenience or safety. This was about a burden placed directly in her hands, whether she had asked for it or not. She looked toward the tree line, where the mother's shadow loomed, thin, scarred, watching. It had carried its young here for a reason. With trembling resolve, Helen lifted the bag, cradling it carefully as though it were spun from glass. Fear swirled through her, but above it rose a single truth. This was hers now.
The crunch of gravel snapped her head around.
Frank Dalton, her nearest neighbor, appeared at the gate, a shotgun case slung across his arm. His lined face stiffened as his eyes swept over the scene. The bobcat, the bag. Helen bent low in front of it. He moved with caution, boots heavy on the frosted steps, and his hand hovered near the weapon like instinct itself. Helen braced, knowing his judgment would be swift, but she couldn't let fear decide for her. The fragile creature inside the bag stirred again, a small, breathless sound that cut through the icy morning. The mother bobcat didn't lunge, didn't threaten, only watched. Frank's brows knitted in suspicion, but Helen pressed the bag closer to her chest, shielding its weak form. Whatever argument might come, her choice had already been made. She would not surrender this fragile life to fear, not when trust had been placed on her porch. Helen pushed the door open with her shoulder and stepped inside, her arms wrapped protectively around the canvas bundle. The warmth of the wood stove spilled across the room, washing the frost from her jacket. She set the bag near the hearth, her breath unsteady, her hands trembling. The farmhouse, once filled only with silence and routine, now pulsed with fragile life. Each shallow breath from the tiny kitten was louder to her ears than the creak of the rafters or the crackle of the fire. Frank lingered at the doorway, suspicion heavy in his eyes, but Helen ignored him. She fetched an old towel, lined the crate by the stove, and carefully eased the weak body inside. The kitten's ribs fluttered with effort, but it was alive. The farmhouse walls seemed to close in tighter, as if the entire home itself now shared her new responsibility, to guard this helpless gift of the wild.
From the kitchen window, Helen caught sight of movement at the tree line. The mother bobcat had not vanished into the hills. She lingered, her gaunt frame silhouetted against the frost-tipped pines. A scar cut across her shoulder, her coat dull and patchy from winter's hunger. Her ribs heaved, but her eyes, those green, unflinching eyes, remained locked on the farmhouse. Helen stood frozen, one hand on the crate, the other braced on the sill. The animal did not advance. She did not retreat. She only sat, watching, her gaze heavy with something Helen could not name. Fear prickled along her spine, yet beneath it stirred something deeper, a recognition that this wild mother had placed her most fragile treasure into human hands and was now holding vigil, trusting from a distance. The storm-scarred creature in the trees and the weary woman in the farmhouse were bound now, their fates tethered by a single fragile life. Hours slipped by in anxious fragments until Helen could no longer wait. She warmed a shallow dish of milk on the stove, kneeling by the crate with a dropper clutched in her hand. The kitten stirred weakly, its ears twitching, mouth opening in a faint cry. Helen coaxed a single drop against its lips. At first it resisted, head turning aside, but then it swallowed, shuddering. Relief swept through her, a wave so sharp it left her breathless. She offered another drop, then another, careful, steady, patient. The kitten's frail body trembled, but each swallow carried strength. Its chest rose with a steadier rhythm, its sides no longer collapsing with each breath. Tears blurred Helen's vision as she whispered encouragement under her breath. In that small act, with each drop of warm milk, a bond formed, fragile, wordless, undeniable. Survival had taken root, and with it the fragile spark of hope filled her farmhouse again.
By evening, the storm arrived. Snow lashed against the windows, rattling the shutters, moaning across the ridgeline. The power flickered once, then surrendered, plunging the farmhouse into the glow of firelight and shadows. Helen wrapped herself in a quilt, rocking slowly beside the crate. Each sound of the storm was louder, harsher, yet her ears caught only one rhythm, the fragile rise and fall of the kitten's breath. The farmhouse, usually a comfort of quiet, now felt like the front line of survival. Outside, branches cracked beneath the weight of ice. Inside, her heart cracked under the weight of responsibility. She thought of the mother still lingering at the tree line, enduring the storm's fury. Somewhere beyond the darkness, the wild kept watch. In that moment, Helen knew she was not alone. Two mothers, one human and one wild, were fighting the same battle, each holding their breath for the same fragile heartbeat. The night grew deeper, the storm relentless. Helen stirred awake from the rocking chair, sensing a presence. She moved to the window, lantern flickering at her side. Through the snow-choked dark, two green orbs glowed just beyond the porch. The mother bobcat had returned. Her shape was faint, blurred by the storm, but her eyes cut through the blizzard, steady and unyielding. She made no move to enter, no attempt to reclaim. She only sat in the silence, watching through the storm's chaos. Helen pressed her palm against the cold glass, her chest tight with both fear and awe. Inside the crate, the kitten whimpered softly, curling into the towel. Helen's throat burned with unshed tears. This was not a standoff, it was a vigil. Two mothers, one human and one wild, were fighting the same battle, each holding their breath for the same fragile heartbeat.
At dawn, the storm broke. The hills lay buried beneath heavy snow, each branch bowed under icy weight. Helen stepped outside, boots sinking deep, the farmhouse steaming faintly from its chimney. Her eyes scanned the tree line, searching for the familiar green glow. But the forest was silent. No paw prints broke the fresh drifts. The mother's absence clung to the morning like a shadow. Inside, the kitten stirred, weak but alive, its fragile body warmed by the stove's glow. Helen lifted him gently, pressing him close against her chest. His heartbeat fluttered, fast against her palm, fragile yet defiant. She whispered softly, though no one could hear her, promising to keep him safe. Still, her gaze drifted to the woods, heavy with the fear that the wild mother who had carried him so far had been lost to the storm. The silence outside pressed heavier than the snow itself. Later that morning, Frank arrived, his boots crusted with frost, his jaw tight. Without words, he gestured toward the woods. Together they trudged into the drifts, the cold biting at their lungs. Soon faint impressions appeared in the snow, paw prints, deep and deliberate, leading them further into the trees. Helen's heart clenched with every step, knowing what they might find. Just beyond a fallen log, the trail ended. Curled beneath the snow as if asleep, lay the mother bobcat. Her fur stiff with ice, her flanks hollow, her body still. Helen's knees buckled, sinking into the snow. Tears froze on her cheeks as she pressed trembling hands to her chest. The creature who had dragged her fragile treasure across frozen ground had given everything. Frank removed his hat, silent, reverent. The forest was hushed, as though mourning too. Helen's voice cracked into the cold air. She had carried him this far. Now it was Helen's turn.
The ground was too frozen to dig, but Helen refused to leave the mother exposed. Frank bent silently, brushing snow gently across her form with a branch. Helen joined him, her hands numb, moving carefully, covering the still body with white until it looked less like death and more like rest. They built a mound of snow, sculpted by grief and winter, a grave shaped by the forest itself. When they finished, Helen pressed her palm flat against the frozen surface, whispering a vow that the sacrifice would not be wasted. Frank stood back, silent, his breath rising in clouds. The forest seemed to bow with them, the weight of the moment pressing deep into the cold. When they turned back toward the farmhouse, Helen carried more than the bundle in her arms. She carried a promise etched in snow, a trust passed from one mother to another that she could never break. Back at the farmhouse, Helen settled the kitten into the crate by the stove. His frail sides rose and fell, steadier than the night before. She studied his coat, russet-tinted in the glow of the fire,
and felt the word rise unbidden. Rusty. It fit, not just for the color of his fur, but for the fragile strength within him, worn yet enduring, like old iron. Whispering his name, she felt something anchor in her chest. Rusty stirred, tiny paws twitching as though testing dreams of running through fields he had never seen. Helen leaned closer, tears stinging her eyes. For the first time since she had found him in that torn canvas bag, the fear in her heart softened into something steadier. This was not simply survival. This was a life given to her, entrusted by another. And with his new name, Rusty became not just a responsibility, but a living promise.
Days passed in fragile rhythm. Helen rose with the pale winter sun, warming milk on the stove, coaxing Rusty to swallow with the dropper. At first, each feeding was a battle, his tiny head turning away, his body trembling. But with every swallow, he grew stronger. By the end of the week, his breath steadied, his eyes opened wider, pupils catching the lamplight with a spark that hadn't been there before. Helen marveled at each change, the flick of his ears, the twitch of his whiskers, the faint rumble of a purr so soft it barely rose above the crackle of the fire. She found herself speaking to him in the same tone she once used for frightened children, patient, soothing, filled with stubborn hope. The farmhouse, once marked by silence, now carried the quiet sounds of survival. And in those sounds, Helen rediscovered a purpose she thought she had left behind. Though Frank had arrived with warnings and a shotgun, his presence softened in the days that followed. Each morning he stopped by, claiming he came to check the chimney or mend a latch, but Helen saw through his excuses. His eyes lingered on Rusty, watching as the frail kitten grew steadier. One afternoon, Frank crouched beside the crate, his weathered hands resting on his knees. Rusty blinked at him, paws twitching, then curled back into the towel. Frank shook his head, a gruff sound rumbling from his chest. "Never thought I'd spend my retirement babysitting a bobcat," he muttered, though his voice held no anger, only wonder. Helen smiled faintly, knowing the truth. Rusty had not only softened her, he had begun to soften Frank as well. The farmhouse now held more than survival. It carried the quiet weight of two unlikely guardians, bound by a fragile wild life. Each night, Helen felt the eyes before she saw them. She would glance through the window, and there, at the edge of the tree line, green orbs glowed faintly. The mother's presence lingered, even after her body had surrendered to the storm. Helen pressed her palm to the glass, whispering to the night, as though the wild spirit still listened. Rusty stirred in his crate, ears twitching, his breath catching for a moment before steadying again. It was as if he too felt the watchful presence. Frank dismissed it as imagination, but Helen knew better. The bond between them stretched beyond death, carried in memory and trust. Each night, the forest gave back that silent gaze, and each night, Helen renewed her promise. The wild might take, the wild might endure, but in those unblinking eyes, she found proof that trust, once given, never truly vanished. It lingered, binding them together across the dark. Weeks passed, and Rusty grew stronger. His once frail legs now carried him in clumsy bounds across the farmhouse floor. One morning, Helen watched as he leapt awkwardly at a dangling quilt thread, paws batting wildly before he tumbled back with a squeak. She laughed, the sound startling her after so many silent years. Rusty scrambled back up, his eyes gleaming with determination, his movements growing more sure with each attempt. The farmhouse, once filled only with the creak of old boards and the hum of the stove, now echoed with playful scrapes and soft thumps. Helen marveled at his resilience. This was no fragile bundle anymore. This was a creature meant for the wild, testing his strength one leap at a time. Yet as joy filled her chest, so too did dread. Every bound reminded her that one day the forest would call him back, and she would have to let go. Frank's visits grew longer.
One afternoon, as Rusty pawed at his bootlaces, Frank grumbled, "He needs more space." Helen agreed. Together, they cleared out the old garden shed, sweeping cobwebs, patching boards, and stringing sturdy wire for a pen. By evening, the shed had been transformed into a small haven. They lined it with straw, set branches for climbing, and left space to stretch and stalk. When Rusty was placed inside, his eyes widened, his body low as he explored every corner. Soon, he bounded from perch to perch, his paws landing firm, his tail twitching with satisfaction. Helen leaned on the fence, tears pricking her eyes. He was no longer just surviving, he was thriving. Frank watched quietly, his face unreadable, but his presence steady. The two neighbors, bound by duty and softened by time, had built not just a shelter for Rusty, but a sanctuary for trust, resilience, and quiet hope. That night, Helen sat on the porch with Frank, the farmhouse glowing warmly behind them, Rusty settled in his new haven. The hills stretched dark and quiet, the stars scattered bright above. Helen thought of the storm, the sacrifice, the fragile bundle that had become her daily rhythm. She felt the weight of it all pressing in her chest, but not as a burden, as a covenant. The wild mother had given her trust, and Helen had accepted it. Frank sat beside her, his silence saying more than words. For the first time in years, the farmhouse did not feel lonely. It was alive, with memory, with responsibility, with purpose. Helen closed her eyes, letting the night air wash over her, whispering her vow once more. She would keep Rusty safe, and when the time came, she would keep her promise, even if it broke her heart to let him go.
Winter melted slowly into spring, the white hills giving way to green shoots piercing the soil. Helen felt the shift in her bones, the air sweeter, the creek behind the barn singing again. Rusty, too, changed with the season. His once frail frame stretched lean and strong. His coat gleamed, a patchwork of russet and white that caught sunlight like fire. No longer stumbling, he leapt fluidly across his pen, muscles rippling with youth. Each bound carried him closer to what he was meant to be, wild, untamed, free. Helen watched with both pride and dread, her coffee cooling in her hands. She whispered to the wind that his mother would be proud. Each sunrise brought new vitality, but also new restlessness in Rusty's golden eyes. The forest was calling, and Helen felt it as surely as she had once felt the cries of her students needing her in the classroom years ago. Rusty began to pace along the fence line, nose lifted to scents carried by the breeze. At times he froze, ears swiveling toward the woods, his body taut with anticipation. Helen stood on the porch, mug in hand, her heart aching at the sight. She recognized the instinct within him, the pull of a world larger than her farmhouse, deeper than her care could reach. Frank noticed it too, standing beside her with his weathered face unreadable. "He's restless," he muttered. Helen nodded silently. She had nurtured him from fragile breaths to bounding leaps, but now the wild pressed at the edges of his pen like an unseen tide. At night, she could almost feel the mother's eyes watching, urging her to prepare. Rusty's restless spirit was no rebellion, it was destiny, and Helen knew her role was not to restrain it, but to guide him toward the freedom waiting beyond.
One breezy afternoon, while Rusty prowled his pen, he froze suddenly, muscles rigid. Helen followed his gaze toward the tree line. At first, she saw only the sway of young maples. Then, movement. A smaller bobcat emerged, coat bright with youth, cautious but curious. Behind it lingered a larger silhouette, another bobcat, full-grown and watchful. Helen's breath caught. Frank stiffened beside her. Rusty gave a low chuff, not a growl, but a sound of recognition. The younger cub crept closer, nose twitching, testing the air. For a moment, the three lives, Helen, Rusty, and his wild kin, stood at a fragile threshold, bound by something older than words. Then, as quickly as they appeared, the figures melted back into the trees, leaving silence behind. Rusty brushed against the fence with a sound almost like a sigh. Helen pressed her hand to her chest.
The forest had spoken, and its message was clear. He belonged there. That evening, Helen sat at her kitchen table, notebook open, lamplight flickering. Her pen scratched across the page. Today, Rusty saw his kin. The forest is calling him as surely as it called his mother. Her tears blurred the words. She longed to keep him safe within her arms, yet knew love was not about holding tight. Love was knowing when to open the door. Outside, Rusty prowled his pen, eyes bright with energy, body humming with youth. His every movement echoed the wilderness he was born from. Helen closed the notebook, resting her hand over the page as if sealing a vow. She whispered into the quiet, "You were never mine to keep." The farmhouse around her creaked in agreement. Rusty's wild spirit could not be caged forever. The moment of choice was coming, and Helen braced her heart for the sacrifice that true love demanded.
The next morning, Helen rose before dawn. She stepped out into the pale light, boots crunching frost, and walked to Rusty's pen. He paced eagerly, golden eyes catching the first rays of sun. Frank arrived soon after, carrying tools, his expression heavy with unspoken words. Together they walked the fence line, checking each post, ensuring the gate could open smoothly. "It's time," Helen said softly, voice steady though her chest ached. Frank studied her face, then nodded. They worked in silence, hands busy, hearts burdened. By midday, the pen stood ready, not to confine, but to release. Helen stood before Rusty, who pressed his flank against the wire, tail twitching. She reached through, brushing the air near his shoulder. Tears welled as she whispered her final promise, to keep her vow all the way through. The forest waited, and Helen knew by sunset her part in his journey would change forever. As evening fell, the forest glowed amber with the setting sun. Helen and Frank stood side by side before Rusty's pen. Her hands trembled as she unlatched the date, the click echoing louder than thunder in her chest. Rusty froze, ears pricked, then stepped forward cautiously. His paws touched the open ground beyond, testing the new freedom. For a heartbeat, he lingered, turning back toward Helen. Their eyes met, hers wet with tears, his bright with youth. He brushed his flank lightly against her leg, a farewell both tender and fierce. Then, with a bound, he leapt into the trees. Branches swayed, shadows swallowed him, and he was gone. The forest reclaimed its son. Helen sagged against the gate, tears flowing freely. Frank placed a rough hand on her shoulder, silent in reverence. The wild had taken Rusty back, and Helen's heart broke even as it soared with pride.
That night, the farmhouse felt unbearably still. Helen walked through each room, her hand brushing the quilt, the crate, the dishes by the stove, reminders of the life she had nurtured. Every corner carried traces of Rusty, yet the silence was not hollow. It was full, heavy with memory. She sank into her rocker, notebook in hand, and wrote, "Today I kept my promise. I opened the gate. I let him go." Her pen wavered with tears, but her words carried steady strength. She knew the wild would test him, but she also knew he had been prepared. Rusty's mother had entrusted her with his life, and Helen had fulfilled that trust. For the first time in decades, the farmhouse did not feel lonely. It felt like a place where promises were honored, where love had stretched beyond grief to create something enduring and unbreakable. In the days that followed, Helen looked for signs of Rusty.
At first, the forest offered nothing but silence. Then, one morning, faint paw prints appeared along the creek bed, pressed into the soft mud. Helen knelt, tracing them with trembling fingers, her heart swelling. He was alive, thriving, carrying her care into the wilderness. At night, she sometimes imagined she heard him, a distant rustle in the brush, a shadow moving between trees, a fleeting echo of the chuff he once gave. Frank scoffed at her hope, but even he checked the tree line more often than before, eyes narrowing as if searching. The farmhouse remained quiet, but Helen no longer felt loss. Instead, she felt connection, as though every rustle of leaves carried Rusty's spirit back to her porch. His presence lingered, unseen yet undeniable, woven into the land itself.
Weeks later, Helen opened her notebook one last time. By lamplight, her handwriting trembled, but her words were steady. I thought the bobcat was stealing. I thought the bag carried loss, but what it brought was life. It was trust, passed from a wild mother to me. Rusty was never mine, but for a season he was my purpose. And when love is true, it does not cling, it releases. She closed the notebook, resting it gently on her nightstand. Outside, the spring wind stirred, carrying scents of pine and earth. Helen leaned back, eyes wet, heart full. She whispered into the quiet, "You were a gift, not a theft, and I will never forget." The farmhouse, once silent with age, now pulsed with the memory of a wild life that had changed her forever. Rusty's story had ended there, but its echo stretched into every tomorrow. As twilight fell, Helen stood on the porch, the hills bathed in gold. She looked toward the tree line, where shadows deepened and birds called their final notes. Somewhere beyond, Rusty bounded free, his muscles strong, his spirit fierce, his future unchained. Helen pressed a hand to her chest, the ache of absence mingling with the peace of fulfillment. She had not lost him, she had fulfilled him. The wild had taken him back, as it always would, but his memory lived in every heartbeat she felt in the silence. Love had taught her its hardest lesson, that keeping was not love at all, but letting go was. As the stars rose, Helen whispered a final promise into the night. She had been chosen once, and she had kept the trust. And with that, she smiled through tears, knowing she was never truly alone again.